Tonight's story is so forbidden it could set the whole frontier ablaze, unfolding beneath a vast western sky, streaked with fire and dust. It takes place where
I
the
have
prairie
waited
stretches
for this
endless
moment.
and wild,
And
where
I
love
have
is dangerous
dreamed of it.
and survival demands silence. It begins with a single glance across a wooden trading counter, small, almost insignificant, yet powerful enough to unravel everything she thought she knew about loyalty, freedom, and herself. The summer of 1874 rolled over Dakota Territory like a slow, relentless blaze. Heat spreading across the endless prairie until the horizon shimmered and the air itself felt restless. The sky arched wide and pitiless overhead, a hard blue vault pressing down on miles of sunburned grass. Beneath it, the land stretched gold and waiting, wavering in the heat like a dream too old to fade. Elara Cade had come west after the death of her husband, Cade, a man 20 years older who had touched her with the same cold precision he used to tally accounts in his ledger. She had married him at 17 because her father, Gideon Vale, owed him money. In the world she'd been raised in, a daughter could settle a debt faster than cash. She wore black for the required year, the heavy fabric drinking in the brutal sun. When the paperwork was finished and Barrett Crow concluded the legal formalities, Elara found herself the unlikely owner of a trading post perched at the ragged edge of settlement. 2,000 miles from anyone who knew her name, her past, or the quiet relief she'd felt when they lowered Thorn into the ground. The post stood where two nameless creeks crossed paths, a squat structure of cottonwood logs and a sod roof, as if it had clawed its way up from the soil and decided to stay. Elara had arrived in April, when the prairie still wore winter's faded brown. In the months that followed, she learned the temper of that land. Harsh, beautiful, and unforgiving. She learned which berries would fill her belly and which would put her in the grave before morning. She learned to read weather in the skittish movement of antelope, to sense a coming storm in the ache of her bones. Most of all, she learned that loneliness was a living creature. It sat across from her at supper and lay beside her in bed at night, uninvited yet impossible to dismiss. She first saw him in early August, when sunflowers blazed along the creek banks, their bright faces chasing the sun like devout believers. Elara stood on the porch with her sleeves rolled high, humidity loosening strands of hair from their pins, when she noticed a lone rider approaching from the north. He rode without hurry, easy in the saddle. The closer he came, the harder her heart pounded, as though it recognized something her mind hadn't yet named. He was Lakota. That much was clear from the way he carried himself, straight-backed and unbowed, from the long black hair flowing past his waist, lifting in the wind, like dark water defying gravity. His features were carved sharp and strong, high cheekbones shadowing copper skin, a jaw set in quiet resolve. But it was his eyes that stole her breath, dark, fathomless. When they locked with hers across the shrinking distance, something shifted deep inside her, as if the fault lines of her soul had moved. His name, she would later learn, was Zevra. Settlers spoke of men like him with bitterness and fear, spitting ugly words that made her flinch. Yet there was no menace in the man who swung down from his horse outside her post that morning. He gathered his beaver pelts and walked to her door with a steady, unhurried grace that eased something tight in her chest. He came to trade. Pelts for salt, and bolts of cloth. Simple frontier business. No shared language required, only the common understanding of worth. But beneath the exchange, something else passed between them over that scarred wooden counter, something charged and waiting, like the scent of rain before a storm. When their fingers brushed as she handed him his goods, heat shot up her arm. She saw it in his sudden stillness. He'd felt it too. He returned 3 days later, then again the next week. Each time he lingered a little longer, Elara caught herself preparing for his visits. She pinned her hair more carefully, chose the blue calico dress that deepened the gray in her eyes. She told herself it was harmless pride, the natural wish to look presentable. Her body knew better. It knew she wasn't dressing for a customer. She was bracing for a man who stirred parts of her she hadn't known were asleep. Over those weeks, a silent language formed between them. Glances, pauses, half smiles that carried more meaning than words ever could. Zevra would watch her while she worked, his gaze tracking the motion of her hands as she weighed flour or stacked tins along the shelf. She felt his eyes on her like sunlight against bare skin, warming places Thorn had never discovered. She moved differently when Zevra stood nearby, slower, more aware of the sway of fabric against her legs, the rise and fall of her breath when their eyes met. The settlement noticed. In a town starved for diversion, nothing went unseen. Whispers trailed her into rooms and died when she entered. A widow keeping company with a savage, they muttered. A woman forgetting her place. The women studied her with tight mouths and narrowed eyes. The men watched with something uglier, curiosity edged with hunger. Elara ignored them. She had long ago learned that place was just another word for cage. She had not crossed 2,000 miles to step into another one. By September, the light softened, turning gold as summer began to loosen its grip. Grass shifted from green to amber, cottonwood leaves trembling at the edge of change. Elara felt that change inside herself too. A rising urgency, as if some hidden clock were ticking louder by the day. He came one evening beneath a sky streaked crimson and fire, the western horizon burning as the sun sank low. Elara sat on the porch, watching daylight fade, trying not to think about the cold stretch of mattress waiting inside. Then she heard hoofbeats. Her heart recognized him before her eyes did, leaping hard against her ribs. Zevra dismounted and walked toward her, something cradled carefully in his hands. It caught the last light and fractured it into flashes of blue and white. A necklace, bone and turquoise, shaped with patience and care. He stopped before her and held it out, his fingers trembling just enough to steal her breath. This man who had faced rifles and winter storms without flinching now looked almost uncertain. Not of battle, but of her, of what he felt, of the fragile bridge they were daring to build between two worlds that had never learned how to stand side by side. She had no idea how two souls from opposite worlds could possibly survive what they were daring to begin. Still, Elara reached for the necklace. Her fingers closed around the cool turquoise and polished bone, and the softness in her touch startled even her. She lifted her eyes to Zevra. This man who had slipped into the center of her life without warning, without permission, and felt the last of her defenses give way like a river breaking through a weakened dam. She stood and stepped closer, erasing the space between them until the heat of his body brushed against her skin. She could smell sage, leather, wood smoke, and something deeper, something that was simply him. It made her dizzy with want. For a long, suspended moment, they did nothing but stand there, sharing breath. The prairie stretched endless and silent around them, the first stars pricking through the darkening sky. They were balanced on the edge of something irreversible. It felt to Elara as if the whole wide world had narrowed to this single heartbeat, this single impossible pull between two people who had every reason to walk away. And no strength left to do it. Zevra lifted his hand and cupped her face. His fingers, rough from reins and bowstrings, traced the curve of her jaw with a gentleness that burned behind her eyes. His thumb brushed over her lower lip. Her mouth parted before she could stop it, her body answering him before thought had a say. No one had ever touched her like she mattered, like she was something rare. Thorn had touched her out of duty, efficient, detached. Zevra touched her like she was a question he intended to spend a lifetime answering. When he finally kissed her, it was not conquest. She had braced for force, for the taking she had been taught to expect from men. Instead, his lips met hers like a quiet question, a careful asking. The first touch was gentle, almost restrained, as if he were giving her one last chance to step back into safety. But Elara was done with safe. Safe had been a cage. Safe had been empty. She rose onto her toes and pressed into him, deepening the kiss, letting the sound that escaped her throat say what words never could. That was all the permission he needed. His arms wrapped around her waist, drawing her close, and this time his kiss carried heat, steady, controlled, but undeniable. Her knees weakened, her heart hammered. She felt his desire through layers of cloth, felt the tension in his arms where he held himself in check. That restraint only made the fire burn hotter. They broke apart, breathless, foreheads touching, lungs pulling in the cool night air. Need trembled through her so sharply it almost hurt. Without speaking, Elara took his hand and led him inside the trading post. Past the counter, past the shelves, into the small back room where too many nights she had stared at the ceiling, restless and aching for something she could never name. There was no doubt left now. Whatever storm followed, she would weather it. One night in his arms would be worth any reckoning. Moonlight spilled through the single window, pale and silver. She struck a match with shaking fingers and lit the candle by the bed. When she turned back, Zevra was watching her, his gaze dark and steady. He had shed his buckskin shirt. The sight of his bare chest stole the breath from her lungs. Lean muscle, copper skin marked with scars, each one a story carved into flesh. She stepped forward and laid her hands against him. Her fingers trembled as they traced the solid lines of his shoulders, the steady rise and fall of his breath. He did not move, did not rush her. He let her explore him, his eyes never leaving her face. For the first time in her life, Elara felt powerful. This warrior had placed himself in her hands. That trust was stronger than whiskey, stronger than fear. Zevra reached for her dress, working at the buttons with surprising care. One by one they came undone, each small release loosening something inside her. With every inch revealed, she felt both exposed and strangely free. When the blue calico slipped from her shoulders and pooled at her feet, she stood before him in her thin cotton shift. Candlelight outlined her shape through the worn fabric. She should have felt shame. Instead, she felt hunger, anticipation, a fierce need to be seen exactly as she was. He lifted her effortlessly, holding her close, and carried her to the narrow bed. The mattress groaned beneath their weight as he lowered her down, his body settling over hers. The heat of him pressed through the thin cloth between them, solid and unmistakable. "You're not getting up," he murmured, the words rough but clear. His voice vibrated low in his chest, and she felt it where their bodies touched. "Not until I'm finished." But there was no violence in him, no claiming, no taking. Instead, he moved with unhurried devotion, as if learning her mattered more than possessing her. He began with her hands, lifting each one to his mouth, kissing every fingertip with careful attention. His lips traced her palms until she shivered. He pressed slow kisses along her wrists, where her pulse beat strong, and each throb echoed through her body. He followed the length of her arms, pausing at the sensitive bend of her elbow, then higher. His mouth brushed her shoulder through the thin cotton, warm breath seeping through the fabric. When his lips found the curve of her neck, Elara's head fell back, and a sound slipped from her that she barely recognized as her own. Time unraveled and lost its shape. The candle burned low, wax spilling down its sides, shadows swaying along the walls like restless spirits. Elara and Zevra paid it no mind. The world beyond that room had ceased to matter. Zevra moved over her with steady devotion, learning her slowly, as if every inch of her carried a story worth memorizing. Through the thin cotton still clinging to her skin, he found the places that stole her breath, the places that drew broken sounds from her throat, the places that made her arch toward him and clutch his shoulders as though she might fall without him. When he finally lifted the shift over her head and let it drift to the floor, Elara felt no shame, not even a flicker. What she felt was release, relief so deep it nearly hurt. For the first time in her life, she stood fully seen. Zevra looked at her as though she were something sacred. He murmured words in his own tongue, soft, reverent sounds she didn't understand. But she read the meaning in his eyes. She was beautiful. She was cherished. She was worth patience. He bent his head again, and his mouth traced a slow path over her bare skin. He pressed his lips to the hollow at her throat, feeling her pulse jump wildly beneath him. He followed the line of her collarbone, lingered where her skin was most tender, where candlelight shimmered gold across her curves. Elara's fingers tangled in his dark hair as he moved lower. Her back lifted from the mattress, breath breaking into uneven gasps that filled the small room. Every nerve in her body seemed awakened, alive in a way she had never imagined possible. She felt everything. The coarse weave of the sheets beneath her, the cool sweep of night air against overheated skin, the contrast between the softness of his mouth and the faint scrape of stubble along his jaw. Her body became music beneath his hands, and he learned its rhythm with careful attention. He watched her face as he moved, adjusting, listening to the sounds she made, the way she shifted under him. He explored her with a patience that bordered on reverence, tracing her curves with slow dedication, hands gliding over her hips and thighs as though mapping land no one had charted before. Again and again, she felt herself rising towards something fierce and unstoppable, only for him to ease her back with a quiet smile and begin anew somewhere else. She lost count of how many times she hovered at the brink, whispering his name without meaning to, pleading without words. He was relentless in his control, unwavering in his focus. By the time he finally allowed her to fall, her body was drawn tight as a bowstring, trembling with the strain of it. When release finally came, it shattered through her. It rolled over her in wave after wave, leaving her shaking, voice echoing against the wooden walls. She heard herself cry, "Zevra," again and again, half prayer, half surrender. He gathered her close as the tremors faded, holding her steady while her breath slowly found its rhythm. Tears slipped down her temples into her hair, and she didn't bother to brush them away. She had never known it was possible to feel this deeply, to inhabit her own skin so completely. Thorn had never given her anything close to this. He had never even tried. But the night was not finished. When her strength returned, Elara pressed against Zevra's chest until he rolled onto his back. She rose above him with quiet determination, and surprise flickered in his eyes before turning to heat. Now, it was her turn. She traced his face with her fingertips, committing every line to memory. The angle of his cheekbones, the curve of his mouth, the faint scar above his brow she had never noticed before. She kissed his eyelids when they fluttered shut, brushed her lips across his nose, the corner of his mouth, until he turned and caught her in another kiss. She moved lower, following the strong line of his neck, feeling the low sound that rumbled in his chest. His shoulders were broad and powerful, built for war, yet gentle in the way they held her. She found the marks of his past, the small puckered scar of an old bullet wound, the thin line from a blade long ago. She kissed each one softly, and he shuddered beneath her, His chest was firm and warm under her hands. She explored him slowly, learning what drew sharp breaths from him, what made his fingers tighten at her waist. He murmured words in Lakota, low and urgent. And though she did not understand them, she understood the tone. She discovered how sensitive he was to the lightest touch, how laughter caught in his throat when she traced his ribs, how his breath faltered when she followed the dark line of hair down his stomach. And in that discovery, she realized something new. Power wore many faces. All her life she had belonged to someone. First Gideon Vale, then Thorn Cade, then the narrow expectations of a town that saw her as property more than person. But here, in this small bed, with this fierce and beautiful man beneath her, she felt something she had never known. She could undo him with a touch. She could draw a groan from his lips with a kiss. She could make this proud warrior plead without speaking a word. Hours slipped by unnoticed. The candle burned itself into a shallow pool of wax. Outside, the moon drifted across the sky. They came together, drifted apart, rested, and began again, learning each other without restraint, without secrets. By the time the first gray hint of dawn crept through the window, Elara knew Zevra's body as intimately as her own. She could sense his reactions before they happened, anticipate the catch in his breath, the tightening of his hands. They lay entwined as the sun rose, limbs tangled, skin warm against skin. Elara rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath her ear. His fingers moved lazily along her back. Neither of them spoke. Words would have diminished what they had shared. Silence wrapped around them like a blanket. Safe, whole, fragile. But morning would not wait. The light strengthened, and the sounds of the prairie began to stir beyond the window. Birds calling, wind brushing the grass, life waking once more. Morning sounds drifted through the open window. Birds calling across the grass, insects humming low in the weeds. And somewhere far off, a lone coyote lifting its voice to greet the dawn. Zevra shifted beneath her, drawing in a slow breath that seemed to come from deep inside his chest. Elara felt it where her cheek rested against him. After a long moment, he spoke. "I have to go." His voice was rough, worn thin by the night. The words dropped between them, heavy and unavoidable, like stones breaking the surface of still water. Elara nodded against him, but didn't lift her head. She already knew. Soon Orson Pike would unlock his store. Torrin Hale would light the forge. Darius Wynn would ride out toward his fields. And if any one of them saw Zevra walking out of her door at sunrise, there would be no mercy in what followed. Knowing that didn't make letting him go any easier. He tilted her chin up with his finger until she had no choice but to meet his eyes. Everything was there. Love, hunger, defiance, and a fragile hope that refused to die. He spoke softly in Lakota first, the words flowing low and steady. Then he said in English, voice thick with feeling, "My heart stays with you now. I'll come back for it. I'll come back for you. That's my promise." The months that followed were a slow ache. They lived in fragments, stolen nights and careful goodbyes. Zevra came when he could, slipping through darkness like smoke, knocking softly only when he was certain no one watched. Sometimes they loved in a rush, knowing time was short. Other nights stretched long and unguarded, and they moved slower, memorizing each other all over again. Elara kept the turquoise necklace hidden beneath her dress, the cool stones resting against her skin like a secret vow. When loneliness pressed too hard against her ribs, she would close her fingers around it and remember the weight of his hands, the sound of her name in his voice. Those memories carried her through the whispers, the narrowed eyes, the cold greetings from neighbors who pretended not to stare. Then winter came down hard. Snow swallowed the prairie, burying the grasslands in white drifts that cut off roads and swallowed fences. Travel became nearly impossible. The wind howled without mercy. Elara spent Christmas alone beside the fire, a cup of tea cooling in her hands while snow slid past the window in thick silence. She wondered where Zevra was, whether he had shelter, whether he was warm, whether he thought of her the way she thought of him. He arrived on the coldest night in January. A heavy knock. When she opened the door, he staggered inside, half frozen, blood soaking the side of his buckskin. The snow at his feet turned red. "Elara," he breathed before collapsing against her. She dragged him inside and bolted the door, shutting out the wind, and the town that would never forgive her for this. His weight carried them both to the floor. She held him there, cradling his head against her shoulder as tears burned down her face. "The soldiers found our winter camp," Zevra said in broken, strained English once she got him onto the bed. "Captain Hollis Vane. They came before dawn. Many dead. Old ones, children." His voice broke on the last word. "I had nowhere else to go." Her heart cracked wide open. By firelight, she worked on him. The bullet had passed through his side, missing anything vital, but he had lost too much blood. His skin had gone pale beneath its copper tone. She poured whiskey over the wound. He hissed between clenched teeth, but never pulled away. She packed it with clean cloth and bound it tight, tearing strips from her own petticoat to keep the dressing in place. All the while, his dark eyes stayed on her face. "Why?" he asked once she finished. One word, heavy as a confession. Why risk everything? Why love a man the world insisted she should hate? Elara leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. She breathed him in, smoke, sage, blood, and the steady strength beneath it all. "Because you're mine," she said quietly, "and I'm yours. Whatever they try to take from us, they can't change that." That night, with the wind tearing at the walls and the fire burning low, they came together with a gentleness shaped by fear. His injury forced him to move carefully. He let her guide the rhythm, let her set the pace. She felt the trust in that surrender. As they moved, she watched his face, the way pleasure softened his features, the way his eyes closed and then opened again, as if he refused to miss a single second of her. His hands steadied at her hips, guiding but never demanding. Once more, the world narrowed to nothing but breath and heartbeat and the quiet space between their bodies. When release came, it was quieter than before, but deeper. Their cries mingled in the cold air. Something inside Elara broke open and healed at the same time. She collapsed against him, tears sliding freely down her cheeks. Zevra wrapped his arms around her, holding her as if she were the only solid ground left in a shifting world. Spring arrived slow and uncertain. Snow melted in patches. Grass pushed up stubborn and green. Zevra's wound closed, the angry red fading to silver scars among the others that marked his skin. But healing brought hard truth. He could not stay. Not here. Not where men like Orson Pike and Sylvan Creed would always see him as a threat. Not where Captain Hollis Vane's patrol might ride through again. And she could not ask him to abandon his people. The survivors who still looked to elders like Nakua, who still protected children like Aro. The thought of losing him felt worse than any winter. One morning in late April, when the prairie shimmered green once more, Zevra cupped her face in his hands. "Come with me," he said. "Leave this place. Leave it all. Be my wife." Elara looked around the trading post. The shelves lined with goods, the ledgers filled in her careful hand, the life she had pieced together from the wreckage of her marriage to Thorn Cade. This place had been her refuge. It had also been her cage. Her reputation was already ruined in the eyes of the town. Loving Zevra had cost her what little acceptance she once held. None of it felt important anymore. She turned back to him, to the future he was offering, a life with no guarantees except love and open sky. A life with no promises, no protection, nothing but love, and miles of open prairie stretching into the unknown. Elara drew breath to answer him. The word yes had been growing inside her for months, ready to break free. Then hoofbeats split the morning wide open. They thundered in from the east, a dozen riders cutting through the fresh light, dust rising behind them like smoke. Elara recognized them long before they reached the yard. Orson Pike in front, Torrin Hale at his side, Darius Wynn riding stiff-backed, Sylvan Creed with his jaw clenched tight. Men who had measured her with cold eyes, men who had whispered and judged, men who had finally decided whispers were no longer enough. What followed carved itself into Elara's memory with brutal clarity. Shouts, accusations, words twisted with hatred and dressed up as righteousness. Zevra stepped forward, unarmed, shoulders squared, his chin lifted, proud and unyielding, even as rifles were drawn and aimed square at his chest. Elara did not think. She moved. She threw herself in front of him, arms spread wide, her body shielding his. She shouted. She never remembered what she said, only that the sound tore from somewhere deep and raw inside her. For a heartbeat, the world held still. And then something shifted. Maeve Rourke stepped forward, Orson Pike's wife, who had never once offered Elara kindness, who had watched from porches and windows with the rest of them. Now she stood in front of the mounted men, Bible clutched tight in her hand. There was iron in her gaze. "This isn't who we are," Maeve said, her voice carrying across the yard, steady as a church bell. "This isn't why we came west." Silence fell heavier than any rifle. "We came for freedom," she continued. "Freedom to live how we choose. Freedom to love who we choose. If that means nothing, then we've already lost what little goodness we claim to stand for." The men shifted in their saddles. Orson Pike's jaw tightened. Torrin Hale looked down at his reins. Darius Wynn avoided her eyes. One by one, rifles lowered. No one wanted to be the man who fired first, with Maeve Rourke watching. Without another word, they turned their horses. Dust swallowed them as they rode back the way they came. When the yard fell quiet again, Elara and Zevra stood alone in the settling haze, still breathing, still together. There was no more doubt. They left that night. Elara packed only what her saddlebags would hold. She did not look back at the trading post, at the ledgers, at the life she had built from the ashes of Thorn Cade's name. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the man riding beside her beneath a rising moon, and the fierce love that had survived judgment, winter, and gun barrels. Years later, when silver streaked Elara's hair and the prairie wind had traced its lines across her face, she would tell their story to anyone willing to listen. She would speak of finding love where no one thought it possible, of building a life on the edge of two worlds, neither fully his nor fully hers, but something new they forged together. She would say that Zevra loved her every night of their marriage with the same reverence, the same fire, the same unshaken devotion that had marked their first. "Some folks spend their whole lives waiting to feel what we felt," she would say, her aged fingers brushing the turquoise stones still resting over her heart. "Most never do. But we did. And I'd pay any price again for that." Those who listened would see it in her eyes, the memory of something that had defied hatred and time. They would understand that passion, when guided by tenderness, does not destroy peace. It creates it. That love strong enough to risk everything can build a world where none existed before. And that sometimes, beneath a vast western sky, two hearts daring enough to choose each other can carve out a universe all their own. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal/disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.